Hello, and welcome to Day 3 webinar, Positive Behavior Support and Functional Assessment. Today we'll be going over some behavioral principles. So the first thing that we need you to understand is that behavior changes due to changes in the environment. Effectively, that behavior and in the environment are linked together and they act accordingly. Effective management procedures are based on consideration of the relationship between the environment and the behavior of concern. So some key behavioral principles that we're going to go over is positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement. We're going to talk a little bit about punishment, but in terms of things that happen naturally, not forms of punishment that are prohibited procedures, such as aversive or deprivation procedures, and they may not be used as a substitute for adequate staffing or as punishment or for staff convenience under 245D. It's important that we understand that extinction is not a form of punishment, but that instead extinction is that no positive reinforcers are, in extinction, no positive reinforcers are removed from a person. So reinforcement is anything that increases the likelihood that a behavior will occur again. And there's both positive and negative reinforcement. Positive reinforcement is adding something to increase the likelihood that the behavior will occur again. So this could be something like praising somebody for a job well done, and they do that job again well. If you offer somebody a ticket or that somebody can accumulate to buy prizes, if the person engages in that behavior more often as a result of that intervention or as a result of getting those tickets or tokens, then it's positive reinforcement. Another example would be offering 15 minutes of computer time for completing chores. Again, if chores are completed more often in light of being offered that 15 minutes of computer time, then it's likely that it's operating as positive reinforcement. On the contrast, negative reinforcement is taking away something to increase the likelihood that the behavior will occur again. What's important to understand with positive and negative reinforcement is that it's not about quality. It's not about what we think of as positive and negative in terms of qualitative understanding of those terms, but instead it's just about adding or taking away. So an example of negative reinforcement would be taking away a chore for engaging in some appropriate behavior, and then that appropriate behavior continues to occur more often. Allowing somebody to take a short break from work after giving a break card. These are examples of negative reinforcement. We're going to talk a little bit about punishment, but only as a principle, in that when behavior is followed by a consequence that decreases the behavior's future rate of occurrence, then it's punishment. It's not punishment just because someone views the consequent or event as unpleasant. The behavior has to actually decrease. And so one example of this in the natural environment, say for example, I go up to somebody and I give them lots of attention for engaging in a certain appropriate behavior. But instead, that behavior, instead of increasing like I thought it would because I was giving them lots of good attention and positive what I thought was positive reinforcement, instead that behavior ends up decreasing. It turns out in this situation, my behavior acted as a punisher for this individual instead because their behavior decreased as a result. Not everybody likes attention. I have colleagues at work that don't like attention as much as other people. And so if you give them attention, and this is just an example, giving them attention actually decreases the likelihood that that behavior will occur again. And so it acts as punishment. So we just want you to understand punishment as a principle, but it is in no way condoned that we use aversive or depriving type procedures with individuals that we support. The next principle that we want to talk about is extinction. Extinction is when a previously reinforced behavior is no longer reinforced and the rate of occurrence decreases. So, for example, if you're giving somebody attention for engaging, reprimanding somebody, let's say, so it's giving attention for engaging in certain behaviors, we are hoping that then by removing our attention that those behaviors stop occurring. So extinction first. After first implementing extinction, usually consisting of a sudden or temporary increase in how often the behavior occurs. So for example, I love the pop machine example because I think it really illustrates this principle. of what an extinction burst looks like. So if I put my money into a pop machine, I expect that when I push a button that a pop or a soda is going to come out for me. If I put my money in and I push the button and nothing happens, that's extinction. Because that previously reinforced behavior is no longer reinforced. I'm no longer getting the soda that I put my money in for and push the button for. So my response is pushing the button or putting my money in, and the reinforcer is the soda. Well, in the case where I put my money in and I push the button and nothing happens, it's not likely that I just say, oh, no pop today, and walk away. Instead, what I probably do is maybe push the button a few more times so my responses increase. I might actually try to get my money back, and if that doesn't work, I might try again. I might say, oh, well, maybe there's no Coke today, so I'll try a Sprite. And if that doesn't work, I'll try a water. I try different responses before I give up. I might even shake the machine a little bit. I might utter a few choice words at the machine. All of these are examples of an extinction burst, because when my behavior was placed on extinction, my behavior, my responses increased. Now we're going to talk about operational definitions. An operational definition is a very detailed and accurate description of behavior that we want to measure. It's how the behavior is defined, and how we define it may differ for different purposes for measuring it. But the important thing to understand is that operational definitions need to be objective. They need to be measurable, so it needs to be in terms that we can measure, and it needs to be observable, so not internal states, but instead things that we see externally. It needs to be clear and unambiguous. It needs to be so that if I come in the room and say, this is what aggression looks like, that somebody else can come in the room and say, yes, that is aggression, and I see the same thing. So somebody else could come in and identify the same behavior. And it needs to be complete. So it needs to identify the limits of the behavior, including those occurrences and non-occurrences, or examples and non-examples. We actually have an ICI, Institute on Community Integration, operational definitions list to help assist staff with entry of incident reports. It can be helpful for uniform, standardized reporting. There's a handout which is available on mnpsp.org. It can be modified for your agency, but it does not override required incident reports for DHS, your agency policies, or other policies, procedures, or regulations. But this handout or this form is available on mnpsp.org so that you can go and use it at your leisure. So a functional approach to assessment assumes that individuals will behave in adaptive ways to ongoing changes in their environment. So for example, in this way, we want to conceive of challenging behavior as an adaptive strategy. It's something that people do as functional to the individual who's engaging in the behavior. It may be due to factors within the individual. It could be because of factors within the environment, or it could be that interaction between the individual and the environmental factors. But when we break it down, there are two basic functions of behavior. You have challenging behavior, or any behavior for that matter. And the two basic functions are to obtain or get something, or to escape or avoid something. To obtain something would be positive reinforcement, while escaping or avoiding would be negative reinforcement. Then you can escape or avoid or obtain or get a tangible activity. So this could be a can of soda, this could be computer time, this could be access to a particular item. So it could be that you want to get that item or activity, or that you want to escape or avoid that item or activity. Or in the case of escape or avoid, I often think of task demands. So you might be wanting to escape or avoid task demands. When it comes to, there's also social. So that would be attention in the form of adult or peer. So you might want to obtain or get social attention, or you might want to escape or avoid social attention, as in that example from before. And then there's avoiding or obtaining sensory stimulation. So for example, it might be that noises are too much for you, so you put on noise canceling headphones in order to mitigate the loud noises. Now, there are socially motivated behaviors and non-socially motivated behaviors, and that place in between it's always important to first rule out what might be non-socially motivated behaviors, things like biological things that might be going on. If the person is experiencing pain, if they're experiencing headaches or medication things, so non-socially motivated behaviors. Where socially motivated behaviors would be things like gaining attention, doing something to obtain a tangible or escape a tangible. But it's important to know if things are motivated socially or non-socially, because if it's non-socially motivated, it might be some biological function that we need to address that might mitigate or alleviate that behavior entirely. Here is a matrix showing different versions of what obtaining attention might look like, or escaping attention, tangibles or sensory might look like. So to seek attention might look like making other people laugh, or to avoid attention might be looking away whenever a coworker asks a question. To seek or obtain tangibles, it might be that you want to work for free time or work towards a can of soda. If you're escaping a tangible, it might be that somebody engages in some non-preferred behavior at the beginning of a work activity to go home for the day. To obtain a sensory, so maybe somebody's acting a little bit irritable or hangry because they haven't eaten yet today. Or to avoid sensory, they want to be kicked out of a room because it's so noisy, and so they engage in some behaviors to get kicked out of the room because they don't like the noise. So these are some examples of what the functions of behavior can look like. So there are 3 sources of assessment data to get at what is the function of behavior. We can use indirect assessments, such as interviews, rating scales, or checklists. There's direct observation in the form of ABC recordings or other types of data collection. And there's functional analysis, which is the direct manipulation of environmental variables. And all of these 3 sources of assessment data help us to understand what the function of the behavior might be, each giving us a different insight into that behavior. So indirect assessment. There are pros and cons of indirect assessments. Some pros are that it can be really great in getting a quick way to look at multiple different perspectives of a behavior. It does require less time and effort for the interventionist than direct observation. And it assists with the interpretation of information obtained through direct observation. So it can really give us insight into what we see in the natural environment and to understand what's going on. Some cons are that it's very subjective. So what that individual's perspective may be, it's that individual's perspective, and it might not be the true perspective of what's going on in the environment, but instead is highlighted or illuminated by different interactions with that individual. It's less precise than in identifying potential functions than direct observation. And although it's a great tool, it always needs to be validated with direct observation procedures so that we can make sure that what we're gathering in these indirect assessments matches what we're seeing in the natural environment. So some examples that you can find on mnpsp.org. There's the Motivation Assessment Scale, the Functional Assessment Screening Tool, or the FAST, the Positive Environment Checklist, and then there's the Functional Behavior Assessment Interview, the FBAI. Each of these is found on the mnpsp.org website, so feel free to take a look at those. Direct observation, or ABC recording, we're going to talk a little bit about what the ABCs of behavior are. So what are the ABCs of behavior? No, it's not the American Broadcast Company, but instead it talks about the antecedent, behavior, and consequence. And we're also going to talk a little bit about setting events. And so this identifies how the behavior interacts with the environment. Setting events, I like to think of as slow triggers. So these are things that might influence the likelihood of a behavior being set off later in the presence of an antecedent. So these could be things like physiological things like pain or discomfort from illness or medication. It could be cognitive or emotional, like fatigue or an argument with friends or maybe experiencing anxiety. It could be things in the physical environment, such as loud noises or lack of light or too much light. Or it could be a social activity when you're presented with a difficult task or a change in routine. So these are setting events that help set the stage for how we will interact with an antecedent. So for example, if the temperature of the environment is too hot or too cold, if you're feeling uncomfortable, the way that you behave might be different. If it's a chaotic environment, if maybe there have been recent staff changes, you don't understand how this new staff is engaging with you, and so you might behave in different ways than you've seen before. Medication changes are big. If there's a sign of illness or if you've slept more or less than usual, if you're tired, you engage with directions differently than if you've had a full night of sleep. I know if I'm tired and my supervisor tells me to do something, I'm going to be a little bit more slow to get at that task than if I've had a full restful night of sleep. Maybe you've recently been aggressed upon by another person, and so you're maybe a little apprehensive about interacting with that person again. Maybe it's a surprise visit. Well, surprises are wonderful for some people. For other people, surprises are the worst. Or maybe it's that they've experienced a long wait time. All of these things set the stage for how they'll interact with an antecedent. An antecedent is a fast trigger. So that is the event that immediately precedes the occurrence of the target behavior. So antecedents can really be anything, but it's temporally linked to the behavior. So the behavior occurs, and whatever happened immediately before that, it might be the presence of a certain adult or peers. It could be that you were told no. Maybe there was a change in routine or transition or termination of a preferred activity. So all of these things relate to the antecedent. Then you have your behavior. So this is the operationally defined behavior, the one that we want to change, the one that we've already been working on. So you want to document exactly what you see with that behavior. If you see them push, if you see them maybe look away before aggressing, or if all of those little details are really great to encapsulate within this behavior section. And then the consequence. What event immediately followed the behavior? So again, this can be anything, but again, it's temporally linked to the behavior. So it happens immediately after the behavior. So maybe you were given a redirection. Maybe you avoided a task. Maybe you were given a stern look or a glare, or maybe you engaged in the activity, or you continued to do what you were already doing, or you got access back to the thing that you wanted. All of these things relate to the consequence. So remember, the antecedent is simply the thing that happens immediately before the behavior. Then we record the behavior, and then we record exactly what happened immediately after the behavior. Now, often what ends up happening when you're doing an ABC recording is you record an ABC, and then that C becomes the A for a new round of ABC. So you'll have your ABC, and then you'll write down another behavior will occur, and then a consequence will happen as a result of that behavior, and then you might have another behavior that happens as a result of that consequence. And so it continues going, and you can use this procedure to gather information about what's happening in the natural environment with your target behavior. On the mnpsp.org website, there is an ABC analysis chart that you can take a look at. This chart is great for collecting ABC data, and if you need any help collecting ABC data, please feel free to reach out to either myself, Stephanie Benson, or to Jessica Simasek. So you want to minimize disadvantages in observations. There are a lot of advantages to doing direct observation, but there are also disadvantages. So you want to make sure that when you're conducting these observations, that you do so in several different occasions. This allows issues such as reactivity, so that individual, maybe acting differently because they're being watched. The more times that you can observe that behavior and the more times that you do this, the less likely it is that they will behave differently as a result of you being there. It also gives us more observation opportunities and more information. You want to conduct the observations across a variety of settings and situations. This also gives us a number of different conditions under which to analyze the behavior. You want to have people in the person's daily environment collect the data. This can also help to reduce that reactivity that can be created by an outside observer. So if I come in to one of your homes or into one of your organizations and try to do some observations, it's likely that people will react differently because they've never seen me before and they don't know me. And so they're going to behave in ways that might be dissimilar to how they act when they're in their natural environment without somebody outside observer. You also want to select an appropriate tool and then personalize it. A non-standardized tool can be modified to increase the likelihood that it will be used. So you want to make sure that you have the right tool for the job and make sure that it's individualized for your own organization or for your own needs so that it'll be useful for staff and for other people within your organization. We're going to talk a little bit about functional analysis. This isn't something that you'll be expected to do, but it's important to understand some of the principles. In a functional analysis, there are several different conditions that present different consequences for behavior. Some of the standard conditions that are implemented in a functional analysis are attention, tangible, escape, free play, and alone. In the attention condition, the whole idea is that we want to determine whether the behavior is positively reinforced by attention. So the individual who's performing the assessment would sit near the individual but is engaged in another activity. So for example, they're sitting next to someone, but they're reading a magazine. Now, although this seems counterintuitive, whenever a challenging behavior occurs, the assessor then immediately turns to the individual and gives them some mild attention or a reprimand or statement of concern, such as don't do that. And then he or she turns away again and only provides attention when that challenging behavior reoccurs. So this seems kind of counterintuitive. Why would we want to reinforce the behavior that we don't want to see anymore? If we're providing this, what we think is reinforcement, the behavior is likely to increase. Now, the whole idea is that you do this for maybe 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes, maybe 3 minutes. You do it for a few minutes to get an idea, is the behavior occurring more often in this condition than in other conditions? If so, then it might be that the behavior is likely maintained by attention. If that's not the case, another condition is tangible. So the goal of this condition is to determine whether the tangible is positively reinforcing the challenging behavior. In this case, a highly preferred activity is identified, and then that item is given to the individual for a short period of time before it's removed once they've interacted with it. Now, each time that challenging behavior occurs, that preferred item is returned to the individual for about 30 seconds. Then it's removed again. And the behavior that's maintained by this type of positive reinforcement is more likely to occur at a high rate. So if the behavior is maintained by access to this preferred item or activity, it is more likely that the individual will engage in higher rates of behavior during this condition than during, say, the attention or the escape condition. Escape, for example, is also a condition to determine whether the challenging behavior is maintained by negative reinforcement in the form of escape from instructional tasks or from task demands. So in this case, a series of different task demands are presented to the individual. And when the individual engages in that challenging behavior, we're going to remove that task demand for about 20 seconds, and then we return the task once we've given them a short break from the behavior. Now, if that behavior is maintained by negative reinforcement in the form of escape from task demands, it is more likely that the behaviors will occur more frequently during this condition than during the other conditions. And so in that way, you can create a graph to look at the different rates of behavior in each of these conditions and see which one comes out on top. So which one has the most rates of behavior. It might be in some cases that we find out that behavior is multiply determined, which means that behavior is maintained by more than one function. And so it might be that we have to address each function in a different way. So how do we develop a plan? Where do we go next? We've collected our data. So now we want to analyze and look for patterns. So how do we do that? We want to identify the level of the behavior, so how often it occurs, how long it occurs, maybe is it intense or low level? And we want to look at those maintaining consequences. What is going on after the behavior? Why do we want to know the function? if we know the function and we know what those setting events and those antecedents are, we can modify setting events so that the likelihood of the challenging behavior is reduced. We can remove some of those antecedents or use some prevention strategies that will offset those triggers. So for example, if the individual, if we're finding that most often the consequence that's being delivered for challenging behavior is attention, and most often the antecedent is that the individual is alone, maybe we put in a little intervention where we give some doses of attention to the individual before they engage in that behavior, so that they don't need to engage in the behavior to get attention, but instead they're getting some non-contingent attention throughout the day. If we know what the consequences are, we can also alter those consequences to limit their reinforcing effect on the target behavior. When we develop a plan, we want to look at this competing behavior pathway. So we see that we have an antecedent, we have our problem behavior, and we have our maintaining consequence. So here's our ABC. We figured this out. We know what our ABC is. Now what we want to do is we want to have that A. We have our same antecedent, but we want to teach an alternative behavior. So we want to teach the individual something they could do instead of the problem behavior to get at that same consequence. So for example, if it's that the individual is alone and they engage in some challenging behavior to get attention, instead what we might do is we might have the antecedent of the individual being alone, but instead the alternative behavior that we decide to teach is maybe raising their hand to get attention. And so that new behavior is also going to get the same consequence of getting attention. Now that's well and good, and that's something that we need to start with, but there's also this pathway where we want to get to the desired behavior. So we want to get to natural consequences that are the same types of consequences that everybody else encounters in life. So instead of this problem behavior and this alternative behavior, what is that behavior that we really want to see from this person instead of any challenging behavior, so that they can get some attention at appropriate times? And maybe that desired behavior is asking for a break so that they can have time to sit and socialize with their colleagues. So it would get at that natural consequence of attention, but in that natural way, instead of just raising your hand and having somebody come over and give you attention. I hope this webinar has been illuminating and that you've learned something more about positive behavior support and functional assessment.